Today, we're going to cook up some vintage spheres in After Effects. It's me, your friend Connor Ross at Videos Change Reality. Let's get down to this composition. So here in After Effects, we have a 4K composition, 3840 by 2160. And we're going to go ahead by starting by creating a shape layer, which we will make an ellipse. We'll go ahead and hold Shift to make a perfect circle, and if we hold down Command on a Mac keyboard and double click our anchor point tool up here, that'll center our anchor point. We will go ahead and align that to the center of our composition. We will also go ahead and in our effects panel, we'll add the sphere effect. So before we dive into any of the sphere effects, we'll go up here to our fill, and right now I have the gradient fill selected. So we'll start by adding we can make our center color like an orange and our outer color more of a purple. So you'll start with something like this, and we can kind of adjust as we want. I'll make my center orange a little bit more condensed. So now, here in our sphere effect, we'll go ahead and update the lighting before we get too far. We'll go ahead and make the light intensity about 115, and we'll change our light height to 59. We'll also just adjust our light direction to 0, and we have something looking like this now. So, what you will find if you are working with a sphere layer in After Effects, or rather the sphere effect, is that you might be able to change the position of your original shape layer, but you can't change the actual position of the sphere once the effect has been applied. So we're going to change that. What we're going to do to fake some 3D space motion is create a keyframe on our offset as well as our radius. So just for reference, I'll turn on my title action safe borders here, and we'll pull our background out just to make sure everything's super visible. We will just change our radius. Sorry, let's start with our offset. Let's make our first keyframe somewhere down here at this bottom line. We'll also increase our radius a little bit larger, make it about 292, somewhere in that range. We'll just kind of line up with this bottom border. And we're going to make this a perfect loop. So we'll go ahead and create the same keyframes on our 3-second mark. Let's just enlarge that a little bit. Okay, so now let's cook up some magic in the middle here. At our 1 second point, let's raise our offset value on the y-axis to meet up top here. Let's drop our radius down a little bit further. And what we're basically doing is forcing our perspective to make it appear that we're moving backwards on the z-axis. We're not, but we're going to make it appear that way by changing our scale. So let's copy and paste our offset keyframe from the 1st second mark on second number 2, and let's just drag our position to this border. Now, right in between the 1st and the 2nd of our seconds, let's also drop down our radius to make it appear that we are also getting a little bit further away from the camera the further back we go. So let's look at how this looks right now. Now, we do have that circular motion, and because we're kind of emulating more the rudimentary 3D style of like the early 80s here, I think that this kind of choppiness to the motion works fine for me. You can add easy ease to your keyframes to kind of smooth things out, but I like what we're seeing here, so we'll leave it. Let's go ahead and duplicate our layer one time. Let's open up the keyframes here. This is how we're going to add a couple more spheres to the mix. Let's delete these first two keyframes on our second layer, and let's nudge everything else back to the first 2.0. Let's copy and paste these first keyframes and drop them down right there on 3. So now we have 2 layers that are looping. Let's go ahead and add a third one in here. Just the same way, we will duplicate our first layer with our original keyframes. Let's bring this up to the top. We're hitting the U key to expose our existing keyframes. So for this, let's delete our first keyframes, and we'll go ahead and actually drag this next set of keyframes out to the 4-second mark, since everything's spaced apart by 1 second right now. We'll go ahead and drag everything back to the beginning of our composition time, and let's copy and paste our very first keyframe now on the 3-second mark. Let's see what we have. And we have an issue with our scale here because I did not also add the original radius size to the beginning of this composition. So we've just copy and pasted what we had later on here at the beginning of our timeline, and that's looking good. So we've got a loop with our 3 spheres now. What we're going to do next is pre-compose these 3 spheres, and we'll just name this sphere loop. So back in our original composition, which I named sphere, we'll take this loop and we'll add just a couple effects to it. So if you have the free plugin Color Vibrance, this is not necessary, but I love the added effect that this plugin adds to a lot of my compositions. So we'll just throw an orange on there, and it's looking a little bit harsh right now. We'll just kind of experiment with dropping it down so it's not as intense, and this might change later on once we add a few more effects. I like a little bit of that extra harsh lighting that it's giving. So we'll start there, but again, that's optional. This plugin is called Color Vibrance, and you can actually download this for free online. So the next thing we'll do is duplicate this layer, and on our bottom layer, we're going to also add an echo effect. On this bottom layer, we'll just take the color vibrance off. That will kind of reduce the lift for our rendering. The settings that we're going to add to our echo effect are by changing the echo time to -0.011. That will just blend all of our echoes a little more closely. We'll keep it light here. We'll just make it 5 echoes. We'll drop down our intensity to 0.8, and we'll make our decay 0.6. That'll just keep everything nice and close together. We'll also change our echo operator to maximum here. And we will also add to this layer a glow effect. I like to use the Deep Glow plugin, but since that's paid for this tutorial, we'll just throw on the default glow. We'll make the intensity 1, just keep it as it is, and the radius is also fine as it is. So if we want to change the color and make it stand out a little bit more, we can also apply a fill. We'll make it blue. You can also use the color vibrance effect here to get the same look. Let's take the fill to the top of our effect stack. That'll make it a little more prominent. To help us see what's going on here, we can replace our background. And once you have a little bit of motion going on here, that's when you start to see the look of this effect with the echo. The next thing we'll add to this composition is an adjustment layer. This is where we're going to start adding our sauce to give it some of the extra vintage appeal. So, just in order here, this is usually the way I like to add some vintage effects. We'll throw on a blur radius of 3 with the fast box blur effect. We'll add a noise effect for a little bit of texture. We'll put that on at 3% as well. We can add some glow here. And we can drop this down so it's not as intense. We'll make this about 0.1. And you can just play around with what kind of works best for you as far as the glow radius. We will make it about 95 here. I like the way that looks. I am just going to change the hue of our echo so it's not as pronounced. We'll kind of lighten up this color so it, we'll darken it rather, so it blends in a little bit more to the back. There. And to give it just a little bit of an added computerized look from like a vintage machine, we'll throw on a posterized time effect on our adjustment layer. We'll just drop it down to 22 frames. What this is doing is making it so that our composition, rather than playing at 24 frames per second, it's just cutting out a couple of those frames and redistributing the motion at 22 frames per second. And so with those missing frames, you'll have a little bit of added choppiness. Once our first loop here renders, you'll be able to see a little bit more of how that looks in real time. It'll smooth out in just a second here. So that's what our loop is looking like right now. So let's go ahead and add a couple of optional elements that will really intensify the vintage look here. I'm right now inside of our VCR VinTexture 2000 pack, and this has digital camera textures. I know that a digital camera comes a little bit later than these 80s looking animations, but it really it fits the bill with the type of grain that we want to add on here. So with the full composition covered in grain, what we want to do is actually track this grain to our sphere layer, because it turns off the layer that we track it to. We'll just turn that back on, and we'll also go ahead and we will blend it with the hard light blend mode. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a offset between the grains and the actual shapes here. That's because this is above our adjustment layer right now, which is applying that posterized time delay. So if we just drop this down under our adjustment layer, everything lines back up. And the last thing that we can do to really add some vintage effect is just throw in a LUT. And I like to use either LUTs from our Vintones Vintage LUT pack. We also have our distorted LUTs from our Distort Tones pack. I'm going to go ahead and use a LUT from our Distort Tones pack. We'll use the Mood Swing LUT. So that adds a little bit of a distorted look to our color. So there you have it. we've gone ahead and created our own vintage rotating sphere loop that kind of emulates the 3D animation of the 1980s, and we never even needed to create a 3D layer. We just kind of used some basic principles of perspective to create this appearance of a 3D space. Let me know what you think down below. If you want to add vintage elements to your own videos but you don't have time to follow tutorials like this, you can also follow the link in the description to our VCR shop, and we have a lot of packs that add vintage effects like this to your videos with just a single click. So enjoy!